Okay, so I know this has been a long time coming. I have put my awards predictions for the Bulls. I've given little tidbits of how I think the Bulls will do in terms of how many wins they'll have this season, where they will stack up in the Eastern Conference, and I mentioned that I would be putting out my Eastern Conference predictions video as we got closer to the season because I wanted to see how all the teams in the rosters would shake up, and really meaning what would happen with Ben Simmons, what would come of Kyrie Irving and his situation as it relates to his vaccination status. Same can be said about Bradley Beal with his vaccination status, but honestly, it sounds like those situations are going to continue to be ongoing, especially after the latest developments around Ben Simmons potentially remaining on the Sixers, or at least the Sixers trying to convince him anyway. That whole situation is just bizarre. But either way, as we near the end of the season, preseason play anyway, and with the regular season starting a week from today and the Bulls season opener 8 days from now, I figured it's as good as time as any to review how the teams in the East will stack up, and that's what I'll be going over in this video. So what's going on, everyone? You were listening to Bull Central here. Hope you're all doing well. So guys, as I've mentioned before, we are nearing 15,000 subscribers on the channel, and as I mentioned in a video a couple days ago, that I will be doing a giveaway for Bulls tickets for 2 at the United Center this season. So make sure you're tuning into the channel for when the giveaway is announced once we hit 15K. But anyway, let's get back into the content. So I think most people will agree that this has been the most competitive the Eastern Conference has been in recent years. I mean, for the better part of a decade, really, or more. The East has always been viewed as the weaker conference, so much so that even in some years, you would have a Western Conference team who would miss the playoffs that had a record good enough to be a 5th seed had they been in the East. Well, all of that has changed, as you could even argue that the East is more competitive than the West in terms of talent. So as it relates to the Bulls and how they'll fare in the East, is that it's not going to be an easy task. However, at the same time, the Bulls and the moves that they made are part of the reason for why the East is now more competitive. So I'll be going through these in order, ranking the teams 1 through 8 on where they'll finish by season ending, and I'll also briefly cover the lottery teams as well and how they'll rank. So let's start with who will finish with the best record in the East and the #1 seed. And guys, I'm going with the defending champion Milwaukee Bucks. You know, I had initially put the Nets in this spot, and I had, I think most analysts likely would have the Nets finishing in #1 in the East as well, but I'm not going to go against the defending champions, and in my view, the best player in the league currently in Giannis Antetokounmpo. I think for the Bucks, the fact that they were able to keep their core in place, with all of them being under contracts in Giannis, Chris Middleton, and Drew Holiday, and still keeping some of their young rotational pieces in Dante DiVincenzo. They were also able to keep Bobby Portis. They were also able to acquire an outside shooter in Grayson Allen via a trade. So I like what this team has done. I don't really know what makes people think that this team can't finish with the best record in the East. It's almost as if people think that since they won the title this past season, that they won't try as hard in the regular season. Now, obviously, the reason most people feel that they won't finish with the #1 seed is because of the team that I have at #2, which is the Brooklyn Nets. Now, I think part of the reason why most people have the Nets finishing #1 despite finishing with the 2 seed last season is because the big 3 were in and out of the lineup with injuries most of last season, and the thought was that this year they will actually be fully healthy and firing on all cylinders, and that could be the case. But honestly, with Kyrie potentially having to miss half of the season because he can't play in home games, which I know most people think he'll cave and get the vaccine anyway, but I think people forget just how out there Kyrie is sometimes between being a flat earther and doing rituals on the court prior to games. It wouldn't shock me if he held out and remains unvaccinated and has to miss all 41 home games. And with Kyrie potentially being out for half of the season, and Kevin Durant and James Harden, yes, still top 5 players in the league, and they themselves can carry the Nets to that #1 seed, I still think Kevin Durant, James Harden, at their age, like last season, will be in and out of the roster like we saw, either with injuries or resting up to save their minutes and energy for the playoffs. Because with a team that has that much talent, they're not going to have to worry about seeding as much. They know they can win the title if they're fully healthy in the playoffs. And yes, they added a couple of vets in Paul Millsap, LaMarcus Aldridge, and re-signed Blake Griffin, and they still have Joe Harris. So again, they're going to be a great team. But if the big 3 aren't fully healthy or not available to play anyway, I don't see them finishing above the Bucks. At #3, I've got the Philadelphia 76ers. Yes, despite the ongoing Ben Simmons saga, I still think that they'll be a top team in the East, and really because even if they do lose Simmons, which I do think that he'll eventually be traded, they're still going to get something decent for him in return because he's still a star level player. And Ben Simmons aside, they still have one of the best players in the game in Joel Embiid. They still have a top 25 player, in my opinion anyway, in Tobias Harris. They've got some young and up-and-coming players in Tyrese Maxey, Matisse Thybulle, outside shooting with Seth Curry. So despite all the challenges and drama that they have had around them as it relates to Ben Simmons, I still think they're going to be a solid team, especially depending on what they can get in return for Simmons. So I do think they'll still remain a top team in the East. At number 4, I've got the Miami Heat, and honestly, I could easily see the Bulls finishing in this position. I'm just trying to be as objective as possible and not let the preseason success cloud my vision of my team. But look, the Miami Heat, as much as I don't think their offseason was as great as the national media thinks that they had, they are still going to be a good team. The reason that I don't think their offseason was as amazing as most people think is not for this upcoming season, but more so for their long-term success, giving guys like Kyle Lowry and Jimmy Butler such massive contracts as they head into their mid to late 30s. And then of course Duncan Robinson, the contract they give him really just to be a shooter. And Bam Adebayo, I mean, I really like Bam as a player and think that he's an incredible talent, especially on the defensive end. But the contract extension they gave him, I think, was a little premature, as he didn't have as good of a season last year as he did in the one prior. But with all that being said, I do still think that the Heat will be a good team with a strong core and an improved point guard in Kyle Lowry. They paid too much for him at his age, but Lowry and Jimmy are going to be a solid duo. Then at number 5, you have our very own Chicago Bulls. You guys already know my feelings on the Bulls and this team. I've been talking about it all offseason and preseason. I think this team is going to be an elite team on offense and will be surprisingly good on defense as well, which we've seen that to be the case thus far in the preseason. I do think there will likely be some challenges to start off the year, especially with the rough schedule they have in November. And even though the guys do appear to be clicking already, I think there still will be somewhat of a learning curve to get this season going, which may impact their overall record. You guys also know my stance in that I can see this team really being good enough to make a bit of a run in the playoffs, likely a ceiling of the Eastern Conference Finals. As much as I want for the Bulls to be title contenders, I just don't think that they are quite there yet, but they have the talent to be a top team in the East and are certainly on the right path to being a contender very soon. At number 6, I've got the Atlanta Hawks. I know some Hawks fans are going to come on here and wreak havoc in the comments for me saying their team will be finishing behind the Bulls, but look, as great of a run as the Hawks had last season, finishing 5th in the East and having a Cinderella run and making the Eastern Conference Finals, I don't think they're really improved all that much from the prior season, while other teams in the East did, namely the Bulls. On top of that, as I've mentioned this before, the new foul baiting rule that the league has implemented for players on offense using unusual body movement to draw contact on players, that really is going to have an impact on Trae Young's game. He's still going to get his and average over 20 points per game, but what he used to rely on as a part of his game on offense and drawing contact to get to the line for some easy free throws won't be able to be a part of his repertoire anymore, and he'll actually have to earn his trips to the foul line. Obviously, he can still light it up from behind the arc, so I'm not saying he's going to fall off on offense because of this, but it will have an impact on his overall game, which in turn will impact the success of the Atlanta Hawks. Not only that, but the Hawks didn't really make any huge moves this offseason in terms of additions outside of adding Jahlil Okafor, drafting Sharif Cooper and Jalen Johnson, who I actually think will be decent pickups for them, but not in the immediate term for this upcoming season. So in short, the Hawks will still be a good team, an exciting team because of the young talent they have, but I don't expect them to move into being one of the top teams in the East. I think their run last season was a bit of a fluke. They didn't get exceptionally better over the offseason, and their best player will have to change his game a bit with the new foul baiting rule. At number 7, I'm going with the Boston Celtics. Yes, a little low for Boston, even though they finished with the 7th seed last season and got bounced in the first round. I think they're going to struggle similar to what we saw last season, especially with some of the new learnings for a first-time head coach in Ime Udoka, and I'm still not sold on the fit between Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. At number 8, the New York Knicks. You know, I did struggle with this one and wanting to put them ahead at number 7, but I have a hard time seeing how this Knicks team would be ahead of a team like the Hawks, the Bulls, or Celtics. Yes, they added Kemba Walker, who is a solid point guard for them, but he's also very injury prone and not the same player that he used to be. They re-signed Rose, which I think was a good move for them and a good spark off the bench. Emmanuel Quickley appears to be a very good cornerstone piece for the future of this franchise and how he showed up as he did in his rookie season. RJ Barrett, another player who has gotten better every season he's been in the league. And I really like Julius Randle and what he's been able to do for that franchise and just his rise in general into becoming an all-star. But honestly, when Julius Randle is your best player and team leader and really your only star, I don't think you're going to be able to make a deep run in the Eastern Conference compared to what other teams ahead of them have on their roster with multiple all-star level players. And then at number 9, which I know this is technically not a playoff team, and yes, there is a play-in, and I'll cover 9 through 15 very quickly, but at number 9, I've got the Indiana Pacers. I actually think this team could potentially be better than that and make it into the playoffs. They actually have a lot of talent. They just didn't have the best coaching staff that got the most out of that talent, but now that they have one of the better coaches in the league in Rick Carlisle, I expect them to be much better as a result. I know everyone always talks about the fit between Sabonis and Miles Turner, but I actually think that with the right coach, they could make that duo work, with Sabonis being the offensive threat on the team and Turner being the rim protector on the other end of the floor. I also think people forget just how underrated a guy like Malcolm Brogdon is as a shooting guard. I mean, the guy averaged 21 points per game, 5.3 rebounds, and 5.9 assists, shooting near 40% from 3 last season. And I'm still high on Caris LeVert, another 20-plus point scorer, so I don't see how this team really doesn't make the playoffs, even in a stronger Eastern Conference. Now, as for lottery-bound teams 10 through 15, I'm going to go with the Hornets at number 10. I think they have a good future ahead of them, especially with the Melo Ball, but I really don't see them making any more push than the 10 seed. I really don't see the Wizards, who have them at 11, being better than that, despite having Bradley Beal. I mean, considering Beal is unvaccinated, he'll likely have to sit out some games in stadiums that mandate vaccines, but aside from that, the Wizards don't really have a ton of talent. I mean, they added Spencer Dinwiddie, which is a decent pickup for them as a point guard. Hachimura, I think, will be a decent player. I like his potential, but I'm not too high on Denny Avdia. But they did get rid of Chandler Hutchinson, though, so that was a plus. At 12, I have the Raptors. I do think they'll be slightly improved, especially with the addition of Scotty Barnes, but not enough of an improvement to make the playoffs. At number 13, I'm going to go with the Cavs. Again, they've got some nice pieces with Sexton, Isaac Okoro, Darius Garland, even Lauri Markkanen, but they also added Denzel Valentine, which is never a good decision, so I don't see them finishing higher than 13 in the East. And then as far as the final 2 spots, I've got the Pistons at 14, who I think will be somewhat improved with adding Cade Cunningham, but likely won't make that much of an impact in just his rookie season for the team as a whole. And then finally, the Orlando Magic. I have them finishing last in the East, as they are really in full rebuild mode, and despite the addition of Jalen Suggs, who I actually think was a good pickup for them at number 5, but again, it's going to be a few years before they start making drastic improvements. But anyway, guys, those are my predictions. I want to know what your guys' Eastern Conference predictions are for this season. More specifically, where do you think the Bulls will stack up against Eastern Conference teams? Let me know in the comments, and as always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.